Hey, we're going to talk about the compressor and the limiter. I was reading some posts and got some questions, and we're listening to some questions being asked, and thought the basic understanding what the compressor and limiter were made to do, first and foremost, and what the compressor also may do for you. There seemed to be some I don't want to say confusion, but there seemed to be some question about the simplistic use of this tool, what it was designed to do. So basically, when you're looking at the compressor, that you've basically got your threshold. All signal increases greater than this setting are made smaller by the ratio amount. So it's going to try to reduce the signal, reduce the amount of signal coming through there. But the threshold, wherever you're going to set this threshold, it's going to start trying to reduce it down to that level. It's that simple. Keep it that simple in your mind. And you're talking about the ratio. The ratio determines this slope. The output is less than the input change by the ratio amount. For example, a 10 dB increase produces only a 5 dB output increase for a 2-to-1 ratio setting. Now that means, like, if you've got your audio and it basically is coming up to 12 dB, but you're using it to compress some other things, that you're going along and nothing's really going above minus 12 dB, but you've got a couple going above it. So let's say you've got one going up that's going 10 dB above it. Well, it will only let it come by 5 dB with that amount of ratio. And it's that simple. Try to keep it that simple in your head. The limiter ratio, limiters are like brick wall limiting, meaning that it just won't let anything come past. It's going to hit it and just stop it best it can. 10-to-1 ratio, meaning a 10 dB increase above wherever you got your threshold set, it's only going to allow about 1 dB increase in output. Like if something's going to go above that, if it's 10 dB above where you got that threshold set, it's supposed to only let like 1 dB go above it. And it's that simple. Keep it that simple in your head. So, I mean, that concept is real simple. And that's your ratio. So you understand when you're putting it on there and you're increasing the ratio on there, what's happening. It's increasing what it might allow past it. Does that make sense? So that it basically kind of look at it like brick wall limiting, something's hitting it and it won't let it come past. Whereas the more less ratio you put on it, the more it'll let come past that threshold. Does that make sense? And it's that simple. Keep it that simple in your head. And your hard and soft knee, I mean, that's real simple concept. Is normally you start out, a hard knee is basically what I normally start with. And and it's like and they say it's good for harder sounds like drums and stuff like that. And the soft knee introduces gain reduction gradually. It introduces the gain reduction gradually as the signal level increases and approaches the threshold. And they say it has a much more transparent effect. And you just basically kind of got to mess with that. It's just, if it's all of a sudden hitting with the compression, or if it's a little bit softer coming down onto it, sloping into it, and doing the actual compression. So the less compression you got on it, you back off on the compression, or you back off on the ratio, and you soften the knee, the more transparent the compression will be. It's like, you got a spring here and you're hitting a spring. Does that make sense? And the more that you increase the ratio and the harder knee you make, the stiffer the spring gets, that's not going to let anything pass. And trying to keep it that simple in your head, so when you're using it, that's very simple. And your attack and release, it's just how fast it starts to compress and how fast it releases the compression. Meaning it's compressing it, you come up on it and it compresses it. And if you got this release way up, well, it'll keep the compression there. It'll stay holding there for 2 seconds. Whereas you got it way down here to like, to 1 millisecond, it's going to hit that compression and going to let off immediately. And it's that simple. Keep it that simple in your head. And that basically the basic functionality of your compressor. And your limiter, basically with your threshold and ceiling, that it can act like a leveling amp there. We're not going to really get into that. We're just dealing with limiting. So your ceiling is basically bringing it down to what level you're going to be trying to stop the audio at, putting a brick wall limiting on there. And if you look at the compressor, that basically brick wall limiting on the compressor is 20-to-1. but at least 10 to 1 for brick wall limiting is what they say. They say if it's about 10 to 1 that you're starting to do brick wall limiting up to 20 to 1, which, you know, just doesn't let anything pass. And trying to keep it that simple in your head so that when you're using it, that's the simple functionality of it. The second thing we want to talk about is, you know, when you're using it, is that basically it's got a couple different things that seem to be happening with it. The first idea is that, okay, here we're talking about the limiter first, and we've set a ceiling right here. All right, we've set a ceiling right here so that anything trying to hit that gets stopped, right? And it's not really supposed to be affecting any of the rest of this. Does that make sense? So that should be able to deal with transients and things like that. If you've got just a couple spots in a track, you throw a limiter on there that, you know, it's going up a little bit too loud right at that one little section or that one little part. And that's, in theory, what it's supposed to do. But you got to be careful it's not pushing everything down. You got to kind of listen to it and look at it. But theoretically, that's supposed to be what it's doing. And compression, and see, the understanding of that, it works, what it's doing is dynamic range compression. So basically what it's doing, you got these sinusoids and these sinusoids down here, and they produce complex waveforms. So here these sinusoids are, you look at them a little bit differently. Each one of these different colored sinusoids is just like looking at these different sinusoids on here. And it could produce a complex waveform. So basically what's happening is the compressor is compressing these and all this noise floor closer together, compressing the dynamic range. So what happens is that you're not just, unless you're just using limiting, theoretically you're actually compressing the dynamic range. So you got to be careful that when you're doing compressing, it might be reducing this down 3 dB and this only down to dB and a half, and it's starting to push the audio, the dynamic range closer together. And so you got to be real careful about that and keep that in mind, because for the strict use, in my opinion, and how I see it, using a limiter and a compressor for just reducing some dynamic range as far as, you know, things that are happening in the audio that are too loud, the first use of it, it would be that, you know, it's real simple that I've got this part on this audio, and this little part right here, let's just say for an instance that this part right here, this guy's singing along, and all of a sudden at this part that he's real loud. For some reason he got glued too close to the mic or something, and that's real loud, and I want to reduce that. So, you know, that kind of dynamic range reduction is you're trying to reduce the dynamic range between this part and that part. Now, the other way to look at that is you're trying to reduce dynamic range of the spectrum. So that one section we're looking at, you are trying to reduce the dynamic range between these higher parts and these lower parts, trying to compress them together. And you're going to push the noise floor up, and you're going to push noise up from the noise floor. So that can be happening also. That's a whole nother application. But for just dealing with stuff like that, you know, my view of it is, if you can, to go in there and you cut on either side of it, trying to find zero crossing, and try to reduce that some in any areas there have as much as you can. Then listen for the transition coming in and going out to see if it's causing any kind of vocal anomaly in that transition that's noticeable. And then if it is a little bit, bring it back up a little bit. And then at that point, you might want to put a compressor on there and add some light compression to try to reduce this level here closer to the levels of the rest of this. And it's that simple. And go light on it and listen to it and look at the waveform. You know, you can very simply just take this, transform it to rendered audio real quick with the settings you have to see how close, and compare it with another track to see how much it's brought it down and closer, and listen to it until you're happy with the way it sounds and it looks okay. Then you can always undo it, Command Z, what the work that you did on it. And it's that simple. And the limiting on it, you can use the limiter for the same thing. A lot of times I'll use the limiter like I've got this section here. And I can't really, you know, one other thing is you've got a section and you want event effects that. That means you want just on this little piece of audio instead of the whole track, so that the compressor doesn't affect the whole track. Just this little piece that you're working on, event affects that. Just put some compression just on that little piece. And, or let's say I've got this right up in here. Let's say this part right up here, the guy's singing like, duh. He does something like that, right? And right in here, it's like way loud, dude. And it's like, and I can't really, I've tried to get in there and cut it on zero crossing on their side and then reduce it, but it just, the transition coming in and out and going, it's sounding bad. So, I mean, it's not working. So I'll put a limiter on there about there, so it's cutting that off right about there and then limit it there. Does that make sense across the track that, or just on this event to try to get it down closer to this, like he's saying, Bob is a win, and it's too loud right there when he says win, but it's all like one vocal piece. And, trying to cut it is seeming to be a little bit of an issue. I'm getting some vocal anomalies, so I use a limiter on it just to cut that off right there. And it's that simple. It's like snipping it across the top of it. You just have to be careful that the limiters might start compressing this, and everything down into the noise floor. So you got to be real careful about looking at it, rendering it, taking a look at it, and listening to hear what it's doing. And it's that simple. The process is go through, cut what you can. If you go back a step to your performance and your capture and do those things as well as possible, you'll find that the compressor limiter are tools to fix problems like quantization, time stretching, slipping events and things like that that are out of time. If the whole performance is really done well, but you got 2 or 3 spots that you have to fix like that and surgically go work on, that's what the compressor and the limiter is for. Not across the whole track all the time. For that kind of application. That was its basic purpose. And that's basically how you apply it. So let's say I'm doing that, and I'll either apply a compressor or a limiter on there, and sometimes maybe even both, to get the desired effect to cut those down back to they're closer to the rest of the performance where I want it. I got a bass player for 3 or 4 notes. He went bunk, 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 and they're just really super loud. So I'll go in there first of all, try to cut it and reduce it, to where it's more, complementary to the rest of the performance, and and to where it's supposed to be. Sometimes it's supposed to be just a little bit louder in that section, so you got to be real careful you don't reduce it too much. And and then I'll go after either with a limiter and limit it, or I'll start compressing a little bit. You just got to be careful because you start compressing the dynamic range of those things together and compressing it into the noise floor, that starts causing some saturation from the noise and the distortion in the lower levels of the audio. So you got to be real careful of that. And doing that with the event rather than compressing everything across the track, that's another good practice to get in the habit of using. Because this whole performance is great, and I just right there. So I don't want to put a compressor on the track. I just want to try to surgically go after that problem that was there instead of across the whole dang track. Does that make sense? Reduce processing. And, it's much more finely targeted what you're trying to do. And trying to keep it that simple in your head what you're trying to do with it. It's not that complicated, and that's the simple concept that you're trying to do. And it's the thing we're going to address really quick as far as attack and release, that basically you've got a drum hit, and you've got, it's like hitting, and you're trying to address the attack, how fast it starts to attack on it, and release on it. Attack and release on setting that, to deal with, the tail of it or something like that, that you put a bunch of compression on there and you want the drum hit to hit good and hard. You've put a compressor on there and you've put a limiter on there, a compressor, to address the transient that you wanted to get it down a little bit. And then after that, you put another compressor on there to try to deal with the tail end of it. You want to reduce the tail end's going, but you want it to go and cut off. You don't want it, you want the tail of it to go off much quicker. And so you put a delayed attack on it to where it'll hit and then it starts to compress to kind of sweep off the tail end of that and reduce the tail on it. And those kind of things are what your attack and release are for, and how fast it releases. You'll find that on, if you're dealing with a drum and you've got a real fast attack and a real quick release, and it's just catching that immediate transient and it's trying to push that down, and it's bouncing off it. It's letting off the compression. And then the rest of it, the whole rest of the hit of the drum and everything, all the tailing stuff that's happening isn't getting compressed at all. So you start increasing the release so that more and more and more, you've got like the drum hit right here, right? So if you've got like the drum hit right here, and it's like, well, it's just hitting this right in here, but all this tail stuff it's not compressing. It'll compress this right here and then it lets off. But the more you increase the release, it's keeping compression on all this stuff all the way out. So it starts reducing everything. That'll change the sound of it. So that's something you really have to experiment with for that type of application. But it's that simple, and don't get confused by that. If you go to look at it like that and use the compressor for the main two functions of that compressor and that limiter, that you'll find that you'll use it probably a lot less and much more specifically. When I go to finish, I'll do work on my spectral content shaping a lot and doing my compression and limiting on my separate tracks and my spectral content shaping, EQing, and all that kind of stuff. So that when I get to the end of the mix, I'm hardly putting any compression on anything, and I might do a little limiting. I've got 2 or 3 spots across the whole mix that, are jumping on 1 dB above, and causing me to clip when everything else sounds great. And so I'll throw a limiter on there so that I don't have to turn the volume down on the whole dang track, and this be quieter just for a couple spots that are loud. And that's a real, if when you get to the end of it, that's about what you should be doing anyway, unless you're really starting to try to compress dynamic range for some reason to change the whole color of the mix, which we'll get to in a minute. And I'll address mastering right now with compressors and limiters. If you're not mastering it, don't master it. Get it to best you can when you're doing all this stuff through your mix. Drop it down to -3 or -6 dB and send it to the mastering engineer like that. Let him deal with it. Does that make sense? Because you're not sure what all he might do. And unless if you don't know how to do all that, all the formatting and finish it mastered, let him mess with it. Don't get yourself all wrapped up. Practice on it. That's the kind of things you're looking for at the end of it. Does that make sense? Unless you're trying to crush the audio, you're really trying to reduce the dynamic range to get all this stuff the same loudness as this. Then you're going to be experimenting. If you can, how far you can crush it, bro, with your compressing and your limiters until it's distorted, to where it doesn't sound good at all. And that just basically just on about any different production, you just got to kind of just mess around with that and experiment until you can get it to where it sounds right. Now, the next thing we're going to talk about is something real quick. Is we're going to deal with the other issues, real quick. Like, let's say I've got this track, right, and we're going to kind of deal with all these issues. Right here, just in case I was going to do all this stuff to this track, which I'm hoping you don't have to, but if you did, that we'll address them. The first of all, I went through and did any cutting to try to reduce any things that were too loud at certain areas, because I made sure I got a good performance and a good capture, and there was not a whole lot of areas I had to deal with. So I did as much cutting as I could and any adjustment I could, and then after that, it wasn't quite good enough, so I threw a compressor on there. I did a little bit of light compression, which reduced the dynamic range a little bit, but it did reduce those little high spots a little bit, and it was still a little bit much. And and so I used a limiter also, and anything that was really going above that, I threw a limiter on there just to catch some things that were going to dB over, to really, brick wall it, so that, any of those, the guys going da 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 da, to catch, clip that off. That's a little bit too loud. It's too loud. The dynamics are too much for the production, and so I've thrown a limiter on there to snip those off. And I'm good to go. I've dealt with my compression, my limiting, and my cutting to deal with the dynamic range work I want to do. Now, the only other thing that we're going to talk about is reducing the actual dynamic range of the actual vocal, and that would be you start compressing it more, and it's going to reduce the dynamic range of the whole performance the more and more and more you do it. And that's not just, cutting off some transients or some loud spots. That's pushing all the lower stuff up closer to the higher stuff. Well, it's actually pushing the higher stuff closer to the lower stuff, and it's going to change the sound of it. And or you might doing that to change the color of it. So that's a different application we'll get to in a minute. So anyway, I've done that. I've got this coming out through here for this parallel processing, because we'll address parallel processing with limiters and compressors also. Then I've thrown this other compressor on here. Now I've increased the compression ratio some, or I've decreased it some, and I've really brought the threshold down. So it's really squishing it down some, and it's starting to compress the different harmonic content. It's starting to compress the different harmonic content here and here and here closer together to color the audio, to make it sound different. Does that make sense? To make it sound different. And so I'm really starting to compress it together and make it sound different. It's going to change the way the waveform looks. It's going to change the way it looks on the spectrogram. And it's going to start to color it to make it sound different. It's just like if you've got a ramp wave and you got the first frequencies up here. I mean, you got the first frequency that's up here, and then it slopes down like that. Well, if you start taking these frequencies and pushing them down, the upper frequencies, closer to the level of the lower ones, it's going to make it sound different. Just that simple wavetable synthesis, it's going to sound different from you changing it, coloring the sound. So I did that with the first compressor, and then I went to the next one, and I put a much more, a higher ratio on it, and I compressed it a lot, and I'm starting to push it down in the noise floor, which you're starting to hear saturation and noise and distortion from the noise floor, starting to mix with it. And so it's starting to actually just saturate a little bit, and it's really coloring it a lot. And all right, that sounds cool. Then I've gone to a limiter, and I'm really crushing it down. I'm crushing all that stuff down in the noise floor, and it's distorting. It's starting to clip, soft clipping, hard clipping, and I'm really getting saturation, distortion stuff from the noise floor and the lower free harmonic content of the waveform and the audio file. And I'm like, all right, that's cool. I go back over here, and I say, well, I'll bring it up to there because I got to add the other ones into it. Then I'll come to this one. I'll bring it down. I'll start to add into it. Yeah, that sounds kind of cool. Then I'll come into this one. I'll adding that one into it. Then I'll come down to this one, and I'll be adding that one into it. And then, well, it doesn't sound quite right. Maybe I need to reduce that one a little bit. Maybe I need to push that one up a little bit. Maybe I need to drop that down a little bit, or I need to come back over here and push that one up a little bit. Yeah, there we go. Cool. All right, you just did a bunch of parallel processing. You got your initial things taken care of, and that's coming out, and then you've done this other work. So you've got this blue, you've had this other shade of blue, this other shade of blue, and this other shade of blue coming together to make this really cool blue. Does that make sense? And then you've got a compressor on the end that's dealing with any you're trying to deal with the tail end of things, the attack and release, maybe if you're having some issues with there, to deal with that. And it's that simple. Try to keep it that simple in your head. And if you use it that way, I try to make the first thing I was talking about very simple so that you do as little compression and limiting as possible. Because you go back to dealing with the performance and the capture, get it there. So you have to use them as little as possible, unless you're really trying to use compressed dynamic range to get, to get saturation from the noise floor, to color the sound, and or to clip it, soft clip it to cause actual distortion. That the basic compression and limiting should be very surgical, and you should not be using it a lot. Does that make sense? I mean, it's a tool to fix problems. It's not something you need to pull out all the time, and you be very specific. It's like, oh, there's an issue there. I need to put a compressor on that, and then you go figure out what's going on there. There's 2 or 3 spots like this along this track on this take that are too loud. And so, I mean, it's too loud as compared to everything else. I went through there and I've dealt with this part right here on when he says these parts right here, it's too soft, so I've pushed them up a little bit because they were just a little bit light. And so now that sounds good, but these are too loud over it. This is too loud over here, so I went through and used my compressor or my limiter lightly, pushing down, bringing the threshold down onto it until I get it, and then I'll take it and I will, when I get done, I will take it and I'll render it. I'll have a duplicate of the track. I'll listen to it, see how it sounds. I'll get an A/B comparison tool so that I'm looking at, any A/B comparison tool so that you can look at one against the other, so you can switch back between that track and that other track real fast. So as you're doing compression, limiting, or anything, you can really hear the difference. You can listen to that, go through there. It's like, it's mine a little bit. Switch back to the real other track and listen to it, how it goes through there. And the faster you can do that, the better you'll be able to hear it, rather than taking the time to turn that one off, turn this one on. A little A/B comparison tool will really help you to fine tune that. And trying to keep it that simple. So now you know that you are going to do a little bit, you're going to do a little bit of cutting to try to catch some spots that are a little bit loud, and bring them down a little bit, and then listen for the transition on either side. You're going to throw a compressor on there maybe to just compress those down a little bit. You got a couple here that a little loud. The first thing that I'll look to a limiter for that, because a limiter, if it's not too much, that the limiter will just brick wall it. And it's really cool because you've got this little part that goes up and you still a limiter on there. Some people say, well, I don't use a limiter for that. I do, because it's great. They say, well, it's not real transparent. Well, you'll find that if you really mess with it, you don't really care, because it really catches it really well. Does that make sense? And the compression a little bit more transparent because of that spring theory that we talked about, that it'll give a little bit more. Does that make sense? And then it just takes time messing with it. And it's that simple. Don't get lost in the compressor. You put a little bit of compressor on there, find a decent ratio, and then start bringing the threshold down on there, and then render it real quick. Go on there and, render it to, have a copy of it and render it to audio after you've listened to it. And then, come back and look at it, see what it did. What did it do to that audio? I'll go back over here and I'll look at it now. I'm looking at this and over here. I'm going, whoa, bro, that's way too much, dude. I got way too much on there. That's obvious. I don't even need to listen to it. I was done screwed up. So I'm going to go back and Command Z that and fix that. I'm going to put less ratio on it and listen to it some more. And, just you will eventually, as you get used to using it, you'll find you use the compressor and limiter less and less and less. And any problem areas, you'll go ahead and cut and deal with. If you're always having to put compression on there all the time, then more than likely you got some other problem with your capture and your performance. And when you do, you understand, go light with both of those. If you're having to go heavy with either one of those to do light compression and limiting for those kind of issues, that's not what it's for. You need to go back a couple steps to your performance and go back to your capture. And it's that simple. One other thing I wanted to talk about is there is something else that I wanted to talk about, and that is, let me get back to here. There's a couple other tools that are, here's one that's dyno. Now this one, you run a piece of audio through it, and what happens with it is you can actually, it'll come through here. I don't have it on there right at the moment. Well, I maybe do. You can come through here and see the piece of audio coming through here. And what it will do, for some reason I'm not getting it to come through there, but I'm sorry. But most of the time you'll see it through here, and you'll see the transient and the tail. And it's like a really surgical compressor that you can really get in here and really surgically sculpt, what's happening on it. And as it hits any of those, that it's going to hit this, and it's going to shape it. And there's another one that's called Sculpto by Schwa. And you should check into those and any tools that are like them. Just look at them and take a look at them. And those will help you a lot if you're really dealing with issues, drum hits, other things like that you can throw on there that are really cool, that you can really go through there and go to the Sculpto tool, and you'd be listening to that, and there it is, and you can go back through there and really work on shaping it. And you can put those all over the dang place, trying to figure out, how to shape different areas of what's going on. And that can be very surgical indeed, because then you go back and listen to that, and you go back a little bit, and you listen to what it does, and you can see what it just did to that. Does that make sense? And it's really, but it's doing the same kind of thing. You just got to watch out for distortion. And, those are really cool tools if you're really into compression and you're really into limiting and shaping and sculpting the sound and the tails and the attacks and all that kind of stuff. These are some really cool tools to work with. So go check those out. We won't get into this too much. We're talking about compression and limiting. So I really hope that when you pull out a compressor or a limiter, that it's really surgical and you're only using it when you have to. And when you hear a problem or you see a problem, that you understand what you're pulling it out. It's not like you get done with the track and you immediately go start trying to find a limiter and a compressor for some reason, that you know what's going on, why. It's like, no, I just heard something I'm going to fix, and I know exactly what to do with that limiter and what to do with that compressor to fix that problem, so that it's not, so that it's more complementary to the rest of the track, because there's some issue. There's a few bass hits, the guy's plunking real hard, and it's like, I'm going to go in there and try to cut them. I'm going to first of all go in there and see what can I cut that. He's got these 3 hits across here, and he's like hitting the shit out of them, and it's like really sharp and brassy. First of all, I'm going to throw that on there, and I might go in there and I might event effects this area here. I might even EQ it a little bit also to try, because it's really sharp and aggressive, which, the EQ can work a little bit as a compressor also when you use it. I mean, that's pretty obvious. Some people don't really understand and don't really put that together immediately, but you understand, you start pushing that down. Well, you're like compressing those frequencies, so it kind of working this, somewhat in the same way. It's working towards the same results. So you can use the EQ as a type of compressor also, and keep that in mind and experiment with that, because I've done that numerous times. Pulled out an EQ and be like, I should compress that. No, I'm going to do that with an EQ, and I'll pull out an EQ and I'll cut out a section, I'll event effects that, and you do it with the EQ. and it worked really dang good. I mean, it did a great job, and it was like, all right, that's cool, so it can do that also. But now that's very simple. So hopefully now when you pull out a compressor that you're trying to catch some transients with either a limiter or the compressor with a heavier ratio. You're trying to catch those transients and make them more complementary to the rest of the part of it, with a little bit of dynamic range reduction, which is going to make these parts closer to that and push them closer together, which may color the sound just a little bit, but if you go light, it probably won't. And and it's that simple, and that's what you're using it for and what you're trying to catch. Or you're at the end of your mix and you've got a couple spots across that are pushing a dB over clipping when everything else sounds fine, so you throw a limiter on there to try to just catch that, without, be careful you're not causing distortion. I'm not going to talk about crushing audio, to where it looks like a solid black line across there. I mean, there's no dynamics in audio. I don't see no point in that. And so that's very simple. And the other thing would be coloring the audio, meaning trying to reduce the dynamic range of, this is a piece of the vocal, and you're trying to reduce the dynamic range between this and this down here, push them closer together to color the sound to make it sound different. That's the next thing. And the other thing would be to be doing that, pushing it towards the noise floor at save time, and bringing this up even more to where you even start to get some saturation from the noise floor and the noise and distortion down there. Or you're trying to crush the audio, means you're using a limiter or really hard compression and really pushing all this stuff close together to where, and also soft clipping or hard clipping to where it's actually causing distortion, saturations, bringing up this noise and distortion in it, and also compressing the crap out of this to where it's coloring it all together also. So those are the applications you'd be using it for, and very simply the use of them. So whenever you're pulling out a piece of audio, you're working on a piece of audio that's very simple and very understood what you might be using Xer for, or even if you need to, rather than all of a sudden you always pull out a compressor or limiter when you don't really need to. I went in there and I cut that a little bit, and I did the same thing over here, and I'm done. Why the heck am I pulling out a compressor for? Why am I processing the audio when there's no need to? So it's that simple, and keep it that simple in your head. And be real careful when you get into, I got to compress this whole piece of audio here because of this little piece here in comparison to this little piece over here. Be real careful of trying to compress stuff all the time, trying to get this crushed piece of audio, because sometimes it's better to turn it up a little bit and then add a light compression to catch anything that's really loud and push it down just a little bit so that you've got some dynamic range in the performance, and it sounds better. So I hope that helped a lot. This, I don't know that I pointed it out, but this here you can download from Doc's Lab on Facebook to keep with you for reference. And I hope that makes it that much simpler for you. And I really hope that you spend some time with your limiter and your compressor and pull out your spectrogram, loop an area, and really spend some time messing with it. So you can see it in the spectrogram. You can see it here on the oscilloscope, what the waveform is starting to look like, how it changes, and things like that. One thing at the end of this I do want to address really quick, that here you look at both these tracks and you see I've done whatever work I'm going to do on any major things. Sometimes I will, depending on the performance. Now, this isn't something that I want you to get all wrapped up in like it's something you have to do, but a lot of times I'll throw in a real light ratio, bring the threshold down somewhere between a hard and soft knee with a fast attack and release, and you can look at the difference between this one and this one. And I'm trying to catch a few of those, just a little spikes that you can see, a few little spikes around there. And if you look at the difference of it, and I'll render that to rendered audio. And if you look at that you can see, and if you look at the difference between this piece of audio and that piece of audio, you can hardly see anything. But I did just go through and catch any little teeny spikes, the little hairy stuff that it looks like there's little hairs across the top of it or something like that. And if you really get looking at it a lot, for the most part, you won't see a big difference. But I just went through and put some real light compression on there. And I've got some settings on some ones that I'll put a real light ratio on, and I'll bring the threshold down till I see it starting to compress just a little bit, not much at all, with a fast attack and release. Sometimes I'll increase the release a little bit, and then I'll just render it to audio after I've done my other work on it. That way just kind of cleans it up, and that's something that, I have done quite a few times, and I still do, is because I'm used to doing it for cleanup. It's just basically, I was so used to doing compression on everything that I made a compression thing for the end of it. It just kind of cleans it up. So after I've done that work, I've done just some slight compression. So it has done almost no coloration by reducing the dynamic range. And at best, it just basically took any transients that were going along the top that were just, were unnecessary for the performance, and just kind of just toned them down a little bit, and you kind of listen to that, and it's just a very light surgical thing that's just barely, it's just like, I brought it down just like that much, across the whole track. And sometimes I will do that, sometimes I won't, but sometimes I will if I think it needs it. So I hope that you enjoyed the series. I hope that you have a much better understanding of what your compressor and your limiter are for, and where and when you should use them, and that you're much better at addressing those issues with those pieces of equipment in your production. Peace, hope, love. See you in the next video.